I wanted to start, if I may, by telling you a story. So you're well-informed people, and I think, I'm guessing, betting, that all of you have heard of Cable Street and the Battle of Cable Street, which was in 1936, when the people of the East End stood up to Mosley and the Black Shirts. It's a very well-known story. I'd be amazed if there are any of you who hadn't heard of it. Have any of you heard of the Battle of Holbeck Moor? My suspicion is, unless you've heard me speak in the last few weeks, the answer is no, you haven't. And it's a really interesting story about why you haven't heard, and one that I think is incredibly important to your work. 2 weeks exactly before the Battle of Cable Street, Oswald Mosley and the fascist Black Shirts attempted to march through the city that I was born in, the city of Leeds. The same way that they assembled to march through the East End of London, they assembled that Sunday in Leeds. They were thinking of marching through the Jewish quarters. They're called the Leylands. But the Jewish community was quite well prepared. And so Mosley decided to rally his troops on Holbeck Moor. Holbeck is near the football ground in Leeds. It was the poorest part of Leeds. It still is the poorest part of Leeds today. In fact, it's always been the poorest part of Leeds. And the moor, well, it's a scratty piece of grass, to be honest. And Mosley's intention was to march in there, which he did, onto the moor, to have a brief rally, then to march into the centre of Leeds, causing the maximum disruption, problems, and hurt to the Jewish community, attempting to build his fascist base. There were 1,000 Black Shirts assembled, quite comparable to Cable Street, in fact, from all over the country. There was very little publicity. The only people who turned out to oppose Mosley were local people. There was no press coverage beforehand. There were no photographers, no camera crew, no journalists. 30,000 people turned out that Sunday to stop Mosley and the Black Shirts marching through Leeds. 30,000 local people. And not just did they stop the Black Shirts marching, they physically removed the Black Shirts. We know from the later press reports, I think given by Mosley, of the injuries. Black Shirts hospitalised. Mosley himself hit by a brick, a cobble, from one of the cobbled streets around Holbeck Moor. The fascists were routed and driven out of Leeds. They did not march. They got nowhere near the Jewish quarter. And that set the backdrop and the expectation when Mosley went to Cable Street. Mosley knew he would lose. Mosley knew he was defeated. Mosley knew that going to the poorest, most working class areas in the north of England, he couldn't recruit anybody and he wasn't allowed to pass. What's fascinating and different between Cable Street and Holbeck Moor was nobody wrote a book about it. The report was only about the injuries to the fascists. There were no artists there doing drawings. As I said, no journalists there. And so it was unreported. And what happened, in my view, is that people the next Monday, the day after, simply went back to work again and carried on their normal lives. Now, I've been looking into the Battle of Holbeck Moor because my family down the generations lived and worked next to Holbeck Moor. In those cobbled streets, I remember the cobbled streets. Some are still there. Most have been knocked down. That's where my family comes from. I remember it from my young years very, very well. I remember the poverty, the outside toilets that my grandparents used in their 2 up, 2 down house a minute away from Holbeck Moor that they lived in for 75 years. And then I recalled that my grandfather had helped form the Labour Party in Holbeck in 1906. And so it was my suspicion and my hope that my family had been there on Holbeck Moor that day. But as I say, no books, no witness testimony. And when I told this story first about 2 months ago, I used to end by saying, well, I hope that it was my family that threw the brick that hit Moseley. Well, I don't know that. But what I do know from the lockdown, having tracked down family members, is that I know that my family was there, was present. I know more about what happened that day, more of the detail. And it confirms what I'd suspected and thought and been saying. This was the local community doing what normal people do. A bunch of fascists turn up in your area and decide to march targeting the Jewish community. The normal thing to do is to remove them. And that's what the people of Holbeck did. They removed the fascists and beat them. And they didn't feel the need to tell anybody about it, to brag about it, to write about it. Nobody did. Well, not quite nobody, because of course there were rumours. 1 or 2 people passed it on. That's how I've managed to find more details. I was aware of it through my grandmother, but only the fact that there'd been this event, that I struggled until the days of the internet to find anything at all about. But think about it. 30,000 people being normal, got rid of the fascists, stopped the fascists, beat the fascists, and then the next day carried on as before with their normal lives. That's you. That's exactly what you are doing. Think about it. You see, in their own small way, every one of those 30,000 people did their bit. They turned out. They stood up. They were counted. And I got asked 15 years ago to chair the Parliamentary Committee on Antisemitism. Why me? It probably series of coincidences. You know, the wrong day, the wrong time, or the right day, the right time. You know, one of those little oddities. And I said yes. No big deal. And for the consequential 15 years, the message I gave to members of Parliament was, everybody do your little bit. No more than that. Just do your little bit. Because if we all do our little bit, the sum total of it means that we win, and we win easily. And history has always shown that if normal people stand up and do their little bit, The normal people are the vast majority, the decent majority. Then normal people win, that decent people win. And I just wanted to use that story to impress the importance. There are no superstars in the fight against anti-Semitism, in the fight against racism and discrimination. No superheroes. And yeah, I mean, I used to spend 5% of my time. I'm now the independent government advisor. I spend 95% of my time. So time-wise, I'm doing far more. But in terms of the principles, it's no different. Whether it's 5% or 95% of your time, doing your little bit is crucial. And people used to ask me, why do you do it? Well, the answer is very simple. I was a political leader, elected. That's what political leaders should do. They should lead from the front. They should do a little bit more than the rest. The Jewish community is under attack. It's the role of political leaders, not just to stand by the Jewish community, but if the bricks and rocks, metaphorically or actually, have been thrown, it's to stand in front of the Jewish community and to take the first blows. That's the definition of leadership. But if there are 30,000 normal people alongside you, those rocks are not going to get very far. And that's the whole point about everyone doing their little bit. And how can you continue doing your little bit? You're already doing more than most, of course. Informing yourself as you are doing, absolutely. Visiting, learning, as you have done. Seeing, I remember I went to Dachau concentration camp, death camp, when I was 18 years old, kind of randomly. There weren't many visitors. I went round it, and as I left, the last thing I saw was a sign that said, Dachau was a waiting camp, not a death camp. And that stuck with me ever since. Seeing is so important. Understanding, even more important. But what you're doing is something further. And it's a skill that you have, articulating. The better you articulate, the more powerful you are. And that power is used for a positive good for everybody else. You know, and you don't need to tell me, that the Jewish community has always been the canary in the cage for the rest of society, that it never ends with the Jews. So anything you do is for me, my non-Jewish family. We benefit, as does everyone else who isn't Jewish, because it's for the whole of society. But we also know that whenever there's racism, whenever fascists are on the move, that the Jewish community will always be targeted. And we've seen that increasingly in the last few weeks yet again. And if you dig deep into Gab and Telegram, you see how it is. Vehement anti-black racism of the crudest, most vicious kind. And alongside it, vehement anti-Semitism. They can never help themselves, because that's the kind of people that we're up against. But there aren't many of them. It's those who catch on to what they say who are our key target. Those who might join in, or those who'll stay silent, or those who won't turn out at Holbeck, Moor, or anywhere else to stop the fascists. They're critical to our target. And the tools we employ, I'm looking well beyond governments. My job's to advise government, and I do. Government has a role to play. Parliament has an even more important role to play. But this isn't something we delegate to politicians. It has to be greater than that. So a critical part of my role is to take the IRA Declaration, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, and get that embedded into the universities, into employers, into sport, into football as a huge priority at the moment that's going very successfully indeed, so that the organizations of civic society have some of the ammunition they need so they can do their small bit. We've seen it with Chelsea Football Club, but it's not just Chelsea. West Ham Football Club have signed up and are using it. Brighton and Hove Albion Football Club, and many more are about to do so. In fact, it's only the lockdown that stopped another 3 big launches by well-known football clubs. And even today, discussions have been taking place with one of the biggest clubs in the world for how they're going to use it and adopt it. This will help you because it will give you more ways to illustrate and demonstrate the brilliant work you do. But let me end on this. Never underestimate the importance of your small, modest contribution. And I use the word small and modest because I'm sure that's how you see it. Because technically that's accurate. But from where I'm looking, I don't see it as small and modest because I see the impact of it. And so the small amounts of time and effort and brilliance that you put in, I see the power of that all over the world as I go around and I see Jewish communities and I see how successful we are in winning the battles. Your bit is vital. And just take it back. It could have been you on Holbeck Moor. And all of you stood together. The fascists could not pass. And you telling others and bringing others along, that's exactly why it happened. And it's in respect of that, but also to tell the story of that I've taken the title in the House of Lords, Lord Mann of Holbeck Moor. So the story will be told. And the only difference between that and you is I hope that you will tell people what you're doing. You will pass it on. You will actually step back a little bit from your normal modesty and explain to people why you're doing what you're doing, how you've done it, and when it's been successful, why and how it's been successful. Just tell one or two other people. Let the stories go down through future generations. Don't just, as those great decent people in Leeds did, keep it to yourself. That's the little change I'd like to see from you.